Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Helena Morrissey, Chair of the Diversity Project, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, which is a discussion on the diversity data we collect about our own firms, our own industry. And I certainly warmly welcome this webinar and the discussion and the report that goes with it. I hope you'll find it really very helpful. I think it's a timely focus at the moment as we emerge, hopefully, from the pandemic. The investment and savings industry has an opportunity to build back differently, to build back more fairly, more inclusively, and measuring how we're doing is a pretty vital aspect of achieving the progress that, as we generally agree, what gets measured gets managed. If we don't know what our starting point is, it's very difficult to go in the right direction. James Barham, River and Mercantile CEO, who you're going to hear later on the panel today, put it more graphically. If you want directions to Timbuktu, well, it all depends on where you're starting from. Now, I've written in the foreword to the report that's produced alongside today's event, and I've said that actually I've long been frustrated, embarrassed even, by the lack of diversity data, the scarcity of data that we collect in the industry about ourselves. And there's widespread agreement, as you're going to hear, that it's important to collect this data. 80% of leaders say that they think it's important. And our industry, of course, is built on data. Yet just 20% of those same industry leaders say that they are good at collecting their own diversity data. Today's discussion and the report are aimed at explaining why there's this huge mismatch, and then perhaps more importantly and more positively, offering some ways forward and hopefully convincing you that it's really worth putting the effort in to overcome any barriers. Now, I've worked, as is probably rather obvious, for a long time in the investment industry, so I've definitely had more than a glimpse into at least some of those barriers, the reasons why we find it hard to live up to our own ambitions about data collection. This industry, we are late to the diversity and inclusion agenda compared with some other industries at least. And I think we feel some awkwardness about asking those who've worked for us, sometimes for many years, to disclose more information about their identity. It can be hard to engage people around the issue and to encourage them to disclose information. It can feel intrusive or something woke rather than that we're actually just trying to ascertain where we are today. So we can address issues like the gender and ethnicity pay gaps, and we can hire more inclusively, build cognitive diversity into our investment teams and business decision making. Also, many of our industry's businesses are global, and there are very different norms and rules in different countries about what should be collected. And that's, of course, another obstacle. There's another one, and which in some ways is a good one, and that's that we're sticklers. Last year, I asked member firms for the Diversity Project for the numbers of female fund managers and the total number of fund managers in their UK businesses, so we could gauge again where we're at. And I was asked by so many people, what was the definition of a fund manager? Now, I really hadn't anticipated that, but of course, perhaps I should have done. It was a little taste of the problems. But we do need to resolve this. And I can report faithfully from my position as chair of the Diversity Project that today, leaders in our industry are really committed now to improving both diversity and inclusion in their firms. There's enormous effort from the grassroots level. We at the Diversity Project have 17 different work streams tackling every dimension of diversity and at different career stages. Over 400 people are involved in this project alone. We have 75 member firms with us now. So there's a great spirit of collaboration, lots of sharing of ideas, and as we're going to see that further today, a great generosity of willingness to share what works. I'm just blown away by everyone's personal commitment and unswerving determination, and it makes me very optimistic that we can solve this. And now I think we do have a particular opportunity and a need to resolve the data issues. First, the pandemic that I mentioned and the shake-up in ways of working. We know this is a great opportunity and that it also carries risk. We've seen over the last year that inequalities have widened across society. So it's no means foregone conclusion that we will make progress from here. But we do need to know where we stand, and we need to be able to measure progress or setbacks against the current position as we go into the next phase post-COVID. And many firms introduce new working practices. And at the moment, it's really hard to measure the impact of those practices and the changes on different groups of people. For example, are we going to see progress or setbacks towards gender equality if we introduce hybrid ways of working? And second, analysts and fund managers are now asking investee companies, of course, for data about their diversity characteristics, and increasingly looking to use their shareholder votes to press for further action towards better gender and racial balance on boards and management teams. I think it's pretty obvious that we need to put our own house in order, both for our reputation and also so we can continue to attract the best and the brightest who will be looking to join firms and a sector that shares their values. So today you're going to hear more about the findings as we looked into why we haven't done a better job to date. We're going to signpost the various initiatives that are already underway to improve things, and the joined up nature of the effort that's now underway involves asset managers, pension fund consultants, asset and wealth managers, and the regulators and data providers. Everybody has a role to play, and we do need a push from clients and regulators to galvanize those who aren't quite giving this issue the attention it deserves. I'm pretty confident as well that my former Elgin colleague, Sasha Sedan's appointment announced this week to the FCA, a newly created role, Director of Environmental, Social and Governance Issues, is going to help to shine an even brighter light and help us to do more. Extra pressure may increase our incentive to act, but of course it doesn't provide solutions to the reasons why we might not have managed to achieve what we would have liked to already. So today you're going to hear success stories about the challenges have been overcome, and it will show you that it is possible to collect the data that we seek, and we can break down any resistance. Now, you might initially think, I want to put out a health warning here. Oh, this firm or that firm is much smaller than ours. It's simpler than ours. They can solve it, but it's much harder for us. Now, there's an element of truth perhaps in that for certainly larger global firms, but we also know that large firms are really just a collection of small teams, of individual offices, and we don't need a one-size-fits-all approach to make some headway here. I'd like to ask that you consciously think less about why you haven't been able to achieve the progress and why you can't, the reasons that are stopping you, and more about how you might be able to achieve the progress, to try to see a way through any remaining barriers. There'll be plenty of opportunity to ask questions as well, and we have a very great lineup that you're going to hear from. I just want to conclude by just emphasizing that it is vital that we make progress now. The industry's reputation and ability to attract talent are at stake, and everybody knows where there's a will, there's a way. Before I pass over the baton, I just want to acknowledge the great efforts of several people in both today's event and in compiling the report. It would have been very easy to continue to try and muddle through with very little data. But I have seen time and time again that transparency really does create the motivation to take action and to make real progress on diversity and inclusion. The Diversity Project has made improving data collection and helping our member firms to do just that a top priority for 2021. But we have needed to analyse the historical problems behind getting that data. And for some people, this might not have seemed the most exciting project to lead, but others have really grasped it, and we're very fortunate that they have. Matt Cameron of the Ocean Partnership and LGBT Great has really driven this effort, along with EY's Catherine Savage, and you're going to hear from them next. And I'd like to thank them personally for persevering and drawing together both the diagnosis of the problems and presenting case studies that can show solutions can be found. Again, it's a very timely intervention. Thank you for joining us. Matt and Catherine, over to you.
Great, thanks Helena for that great introduction, and hopefully our sort of presentation, Catherine, can live up to that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with everybody joining today, so hopefully this is nice and clear in front of you. But yeah, a very warm welcome and thank you for joining today's session. So what you can expect from here on in, Catherine and I are going to talk to you a little bit about the context of the report and about what some of the data points and insights there are telling us. We would like to encourage you all do join the conversations with us on sort of the chat function, and also send through any sort of questions through to Q&A as well. And then we're going to get on to perhaps the most exciting part of today, which is going to be a panel discussion facilitated by Lanson's Rebecca Mayo and a number of industry leaders to talk about some of the issues and success stories sort of happening within the industry. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Cameron. I'm the Global MD of LGBT Great. And we seek to really sort of help organisations within the industry to better grasp LGBT-specific diversity inclusion issues, but broader intersectional themes like diversity data too. So we work with over sort of 30 businesses globally and have now attracted support from hundreds of employees in the industry, a number of the programmes that we deliver. And Catherine, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Matt, and delighted to be part of this session today. I'm a partner in our financial services, people advisory services business, so HR consulting practice. Have been working with Matt for a while now on the topic of diversity and diversity data, and I'm very privileged in my day job that I work with many financial services organisations, whether looking at diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. What does this mean for culture, sense of belonging, through to I suppose the impacts on the broader talent landscape, and ultimately why should business leaders be interested in this, not just be a topic for HR practitioners?
Great, thank you, Catherine. And really sort of the story to sort of this project and this research which we're launching today started actually about 12 months ago. And I know we've sort of heard an increasing number of requests for support around the collection of diversity data. And actually, for a lot of conversations that I've been having with sort of executive leaders, there are a lot of sort of perceived barriers in terms of the items that are stopping us from getting further ahead on this. So we know a lot of firms are sort of experiencing the same challenges. We know there's a lot of intricacies around sort of the operational and legal elements of what diversity data we can ask for and where we can ask it, of course. And actually, the purpose of this report is not necessarily to go into sort of that level of intricacy, but also talk about actually how a one-size-fits-all approach sometimes isn't sustainable when it comes to doing better on diversity data. So hopefully what this will do is provide a good interlude into sort of further work, you know, sort of in the future. But Helena sort of pointed out that actually, you know, diversity data is not just a talent issue. Actually, it's a bigger business and sort of reputational issue. And it's within this sort of context, actually, that we've been really sort of putting this report sort of together. So a key message for us to get across today is really that actually there is an opportunity to, you know, think about sort of the barriers that we have and think about what the action plans are and the ways that we can sort of leverage, if you like, these sort of challenges to ensure a more joined up approach really within the industry. The Diversity Project's Jane Walsh has done a great job in helping to bring together, you know, different parts of the industry. It's really important that each part of the sector, you know, really works together, because we know that, of course, there's an increasing focus now around diversity inclusion questions as part of sort of the RFP process. And actually, with one conversation at sort of leadership level in one of our member firms, estimated around an 85% increase in sort of due diligence questions around diversity and sort of inclusion issues. Just before we get into a bit of the data, we would like to sort of say a special thank you to a number of people, particularly the Diversity Project UK and sort of Diversity Project Northern America, Jane Walsh, John Terry, and all of the firms that have really sort of participated in sort of putting this piece of work together, and of course to Catherine and Supreet and the brilliant team at EY. So I want to share with you some of the data points now that really sort of came out of the research. And we actually sort of surveyed over 40 different organisations, and well over 200 people have been involved in sort of the responses to sort of the data points. But I guess in short, our current industry sort of position at the moment in terms of diversity data is that it is limited. There's a huge skew towards focusing on gender as a diversity dimension in isolation. And actually what we can see here is that all of the sort of firms that participated are actually saying, actually, we have prioritised gender as a sort of diversity dimension. Now, Helen sort of pointed out before that 80% of sort of the HR leaders that we surveyed really recognise diversity data as a key priority action and a focus area for 2021. But actually, less than 20% are actually saying, well, you know, we're not doing well in this area. So we just sort of highlight, I think, the need to find new solutions and new opportunities to really sort of drive the agenda forward. And I think the other point as well, before I hand over to Catherine to talk a bit about some of the other data points, is that what we I've really sort of seen and heard from all the firms that participated is that in the instances where the diversity data is being collected, actually it's not really much is happening with it. So we need to sort of really see a renewed focus actually in understanding how we analyse the data and actually looking at it from more intersectional lens to help inform sort of the business strategy. I know this is an evolving area of work for the industry sector. I know, Catherine, you're going to talk a little bit about sort of pay gap reporting and what some of the data points are telling us in this regard as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm hopeful that those that are on the call today will take time to digest the many data points that we call out in the report, because there are some fascinating insights into where those within the industry are struggling. There's surprising stats around a number of areas, and a couple of things that jump out to me on this slide is that 83% of participants are not confident, or they're unsure whether the data that they collect on ethnicity now will actually fulfill ethnicity pay gap reporting, which, if you like, is the next hurdle that will require UK organisations to disclose ethnicity pay gap reporting like they do if they're of the size over 250 employees for gender pay gap reporting. And we know there are differing segments of financial services that do better in ethnicity data capture. So we know some of the UK headquartered banks are much further down their line of increasing employee confidence and trust to disclose ethnicity. So I suppose it's an immediate call to action that if disclosure rates are lower than your peers, or anticipated lower than those that your kind of investors, your own employees may be interested when ethnicity gap pay gap reporting comes in, it's probably a sharp prompt to consider what you as leaders can do to encourage your employees to disclose their ethnicity. We know it is a sensitive topic. We know there are deep-rooted reasons as to why somebody may not want to disclose their ethnicity. But I think there will be a legal requirement to disclose pay gaps, and I think there will be negative reaction for significantly low disclosure rates amongst your peer groups. I think the other data point, Matt, that jumps out is, I suppose, the routine nature of collecting data. So many organisations rely on at point of entry. And actually 50% of organisations were collecting data only at the time of recruitment. And again, this comes back to the role of leadership. For many of your long-serving employees, it could be a particularly difficult conversation to try and encourage them to disclose a diversity dimension. But again, if you only have that route at point of recruitment, you're potentially going to have lower disclosure rates for across the diversity dimension spectrum than some of your peers and other organisations where lights by the press, external kind of investor pressure is being shone.
Yeah, I think on the sort of the recruitment point as well, sort of, Catherine, I know breaking down the data a little bit, so I guess sort of more intricately than what's on sort of the screening, but one of the things we did see, wasn't it, that there's really age and gender were the two dominant diversity dimensions that organisations were collecting, and actually sort of sexual orientation, gender identity, caring responsibilities, the other dimension, social mobility, actually in a lot of cases isn't being requested, or there's no option to provide that data. So it's quite interesting to see, again, a big skew towards gender and age, which of course are more visible, and generally when you apply for a job and you're starting a new employment journey, of course, providing your date of birth is part of that. So it's kind of an easy way to collect the data, sort of essentially. But I think the other point for me, I think, Catherine, here is that it's around asking the questions of what are the sort of interventions of organisations, firms providing after someone's joined the firm to provide their diversity data. And I know from some case studies that we've got in the report, and do take a look at them after this session, there's some good examples there of how organisations have been able to leverage this and actually get it into a routine as well in terms of asking these questions. And then just as a final point, a great sort of section of the report as well, written by Lansons, around the questions that executive leaders can be thinking about to better communicate for the data as well.
And sorry, Matt, just to add there, I suppose when I'm working with organisations, I'm also as interested in who is choosing not to join you. So who is not going through and progressing through the interview process? What potential diversity dimensions are not choosing to join your organisation? Because I think there's data on current incumbents, employees when they join, but I'm as interested in those that are either choosing not to or are not successfully progressing through.
Yeah, I think it's a great data point, isn't it, in terms of where we're falling short. So I do absolutely agree there. And I think what we want to just sort of explain sort of next is actually, when we talk to a lot of the organisations, is that diversity data was very much seen as, you know, that problem over there, and generally it was being batted over to sort of HR, etc. And actually, where we've seen some really good interventions, and again this plays out within sort of the case studies, actually where, you know, C-suite sponsorship is really sort of intervening to help provide the story and the narrative and the empathy as to why diversity data is so important. And we've seen some direct you know, impacts of numbers increasing significantly with these types of intervention. I know, Catherine, you were going to touch briefly on sort of the talent perspective here before we build on to business and reputation.
Yeah, and I suppose some positivity that many of the conversations I'm now having with organisations is not necessarily just with HR practitioners. So senior leaders, managing directors, individuals that manage large teams, contact centres, middle office, back office, etc. Leadership is now interested in the topic of diversity and inclusion, which a number of years ago, most conversations centred on kind of HR talking to HR. There's significant amounts of research available externally that evidence, I suppose, the commercial imperatives of being diverse and inclusive. And I think the inclusive point is very, very important. Again, if you have an inclusive culture, people bring their whole selves to the organisation, they contribute, they're engaged, and that too drives bottom line. So there's much research out there that if you're more diverse and you're more inclusive, you're 8 times more likely to achieve better outcomes. You're 6 times more likely to be more innovative and more agile, and you're 3 times more likely to be high performing. And I think that commercial imperative point, that point about innovation, when we all know organizations are going to have to continue to transform, to automate, to be agile, strengthens the business case for the need for action.
Yeah, and I think sort of specifically within, you know, the context of the, you know, the investment, wealth management and savings industry, you know, I think this sort of business point here, you know, the ability to win investment mandates for many sort of asset managers is increasingly, you know, I guess being measured and sort of looked at from a D&I lens. You know, the questions that are coming through from sort of the asset owners and the investment consultants, you know, that they are intensifying, and they're getting much more complex as well than gender and race and ethnicity, for example. So there's definitely a need there in terms of being able to, you know, position your organisations as, you know, against the competition and as a standout. And I think one of the areas of work that a group of investment consultants are sort of spearheading at the moment is around how can we get these questions that we're asking of the investment and asset managers to be more consistent, so they have a clearer set of expectations around the types of D&I questions that are critically getting asked of us. So really interesting to see that piece of work move forward. And there's already been some great work on it so far. And if you are interested in the work of that group, then please do contact the Diversity Project, who will be able to put you in touch. So Catherine, I know this is one of our favourite slides from the work that we've done. What do you sort of think the data points are telling us here?
So I think there'll be no surprises to those on the call that this is not easy. The capture of sensitive information, the requirement to have a culture of trust that your employees will feel comfortable to provide sensitive information, it is not easy, and none of us are saying it is easy. I think what we are saying, though, is it is time critical now that the barriers don't stop you from acting. So we know that there are legal consideration, there are operational barriers. We know degrees of sophistication of HR systems differs across organisations. We know it's complex to determine who has access to information. How can you ensure it's not misused? And again, your employees trust what you're going to do with that data. I think the piece, though, is I suppose as leaders, how do you show that this is important to you, you're empathetic, you're authentic, you require from your managers that they encourage individuals to disclose diversity dimensions. You work closely with your HR teams to think about your recruitment and selection procedures. What kind of quick tactical changes could you make to where you source talent? How can you tap into broader talent pools? How can you adapt and change your recruitment processes to ensure that there is fairness in everyone that flows through and progresses and is successful? So I think it's to recognise that there are barriers, but not to be defeated, and to understand where can you make some quick changes, where can you learn from others. Matt, I think it is really important to understand where others are doing and where it is working, and leveraging kind of those kind of ideas and activities. And I think it is the piece around clarity of accountability, leadership having accountability for the ownership of making progress. So again, the regulators are very interested in this. They are requiring diversity and inclusion to be encompassed within executive remuneration to try and encourage and dispel that apathy and hold leaders to account for making progress. Yeah, and Matt, sorry, I was just going to say, just the time critical point of this. So if we look at Generation Z, and they will be coming into the world of work. We know they are interested in diversity policies. We know they are interested in the reputation of is a culture inclusive, more so than the generations that entered the world of work previously. So those organisations that get this right will draw down and will beat the competition to capture the kind of the high performing Generation Z that you'll want to attract.
Yeah, I think really good point there, because I know particularly in the context of the LGBT community, for example, I know that the number of sort of organisational signals that this community sort of is expecting when making sort of conscious employment decisions, and I know that the point around equality and inclusion is also equally as important to to other sort of diverse talent populations, that those people that we are aspiring to attract within the industry. So I guess in terms of looking ahead, in terms of where we'd like to be, sort of ideally, is to have all of corners of the industry really sort of working together, and there's some great work happening really in each of these different sort of circles that you can see here. And what we're hoping is a collection of effort really from the different stakeholders within the industry will really help intensify our efforts now towards better diversity data collection. I think a key point is that a lot of sort of CEOs and C-suite leadership as well, from sort of conversations that I'm having, really are starting to think about actually how can we do this better. There's actually a case study included in this report from Quilter, for example. This is a really interesting sort of case study. So only a page, take a quick look afterwards. It looks at actually how we create that sort of connection between the request for the data and how and why that's important. And actually, I know when their CEO did an intervention last year on sort of race and ethnicity and the crucial need for race and ethnicity data, they were able to achieve a sort of a seismic increase in employees disclosing. So we know that those very targeted, empathetic interventions really do work. And the Lanson's report, again included in this report, will help you start asking the questions and preparing leaders to better have those conversations and position this with sort of maximum impact. And I know, Catherine, a lot of work that you've been doing within the realm of D&I is all around sort of optimal timing, and obviously after the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were working through that. But talk to us a little bit about what you've been seeing and why now you think is the optimal time to be getting ahead on this.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic and navigating the pandemic and the focus you will have had on ensuring the safety of your employees as you've navigated the pandemic has probably heightened the attention on your people. You've probably never had more data on your people than you have now. You'll have been pulsing them, you'll have been capturing preferences, you'll understand quite personal data around caring responsibilities, vulnerability, and many other factors that you will have had to track and to carefully navigate through the pandemic. I think the mass mobilisation of remote working across financial financial services sectors has been a phenomenal success. Overnight, you saw the shifting of much greater levels of flexibility that, to me, is really exciting, that this opens up huge opportunities to tap into broader, more diverse talent pools if it becomes less bound to being a permanent requirement to be on site in an office, if it enables you to think about hybrid working in a different way, if it enables you to offer flexibility in a different way because you're focused on productivity and outcome as opposed to the hours or the place of work. And so I suppose I do challenge all the leaders that I meet with to not allow us to revert back to pre-pandemic old ways of working, to continue to lead with empathy, because you've led with empathy through a pandemic. All of my clients have been generous in terms of sickness policy, very caring in terms of focus on safety. And I think that's been a very, I suppose, different way leaders have had to lead through what has been an awful crisis. And I suppose the challenge we would pose, wouldn't we, Matt, is that let's not lose all those learnings. Let's build on that momentum. Let's try to encourage more data to be captured so you can take proactive action, but also you can track progress. How do you determine the ROI? How do you determine that you're hitting your targets if you don't understand the start point?
Yeah, really great points. And I think, organisations have adapted very well, actually, given we had to sort of pretty much do it overnight. But we've seen a lot of examples of where, the talent pool, for example, is massively increased. Organisations are hiring people in locations that traditionally they wouldn't have done, because, the roles tend to be centred in more of the cities and sort of main offices, etc. So I think there is definitely an opportunity. I think it's also increased sort of the awareness as well around workplace equity, and inclusion. And we've certainly seen, and another data point that came out from this is around actually that the focus now for many firms is around inclusion. The feelings, how do we create a culture that enables everybody to thrive? And I think there's a real opportunity there to really hone in and really connect diversity data to our business, our reputation, and our talent, and actually really encourage employees, inspire employees, to disclose their diversity data. But I guess the critical point is that we've got to get the messaging right. It's got to be authentic, and we've got to make sure that we can work through those trust and sort of confidentiality concerns that many of our employees have. I know we're going to sort of move on to sort of the panel discussion sort of in a few minutes. And in the report, we've sort of created sort of 5 key points as to how we think we can move forward really from this report. And hopefully what we've done here is really hold up the mirror. Quite bold, I think, as an industry now in terms of identifying the challenges that we have and confronting those really sort of head on. I know that the panel are going to talk a bit about this in a second. And Catherine, just before we sort of pass over to the panel, I don't know if there's any sort of final points that you'd like to make on shifting the dial as we look ahead.
I suppose a challenge to everybody who's attended on this call, taken the time out of continual Zoom calls, team calls, back-to-back meetings that we all find ourselves completely immersed in. But I suppose if we were to look back in 10 years' time, how could we all be very proud of what we've achieved? Because we could measure the start point, we could determine the progress, and I suppose financial performance, innovation, all of those benefits that will come commercially if you have an inclusive workforce. And I think I'm pretty inspired that there are so many people now actively committing to this. And as I said, it's not just a HR topic. HR is there and plays a very important role, but can't drive this on their own.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think as we look ahead, I think everyone has a collective responsibility, don't they, to really help pull together to do better in sort of this domain. And I'm also remain, like you, very optimistic that with the right leadership and the right messaging, I think there's a very big opportunity to really sort of take forward better work and more progress on diversity data within an industry, of course, that is all about data. So definitely we can do better in terms of data collection at home within the industry. So hopefully that's giving you a bit of a snapshot of the report. Of course, there's lots more detail actually in the report, which will be available for you all to download from the Diversity Project's website, or indeed LGBT Great's website as well. I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank Catherine for sharing sort of the stage and thing for 20 minutes here, and it's been a pleasure as always. And I want to introduce to you the panel now. So we've got today's panel session being facilitated by Rebecca Mayo. So invite the panel to pop all your cameras on. There we go. Rebecca's the Joint Managing Director of Lanterns. We've got John Terry, who is a board member and strategic advisor on people issues to the Diversity Project UK. We've got James Barnum, who's the Group Chief Executive of River Mercantile. We've got Heather Andrews, who's the Employee Experience Director at Legal & General Group. And we have Luba Nicolina, who is the Global Head of Research at Willis Towers Watson. Without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, turn myself off, and hand over to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. And welcome, everybody. We've had a lot of information to digest there, but I've got a great panel who I've had the privilege of talking to before today's session. So just a couple of protocols, and then we're going to dive straight in. So panel, we'll skip that first question just ahead of time, and we'll go straight into our reflections and experiences from our individual company perspectives. So I guess protocols-wise, we're going to collect questions in the Q&A, and we're going to try and save between sort of up to about 10 minutes at the end of today's session to see if we can address some of those questions as the panel. So we'll do our best, but time is slightly against us. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is invite Heather to give us her experience of where data collection has fitted when it comes to the commitments that Legal & General have made around inclusive capitalism in particular, but also the future of work and some of the thinking that you've got going on around that at the moment, Heather. Heather, can I invite you to talk?
Yeah, no problem. Welcome, everybody. Firstly, I did want to just say, I think the insight from the report is incredibly timely, very insightful, but I did have a moment of sort of feeling a little bit, a little bit down, and it's a little bit sobering that, we still have a long way to go. But I do totally agree with Helena and Catherine that this is a moment where, organizations are in the process of thinking about how they run and they grow their businesses, operating with new ways of working and new models. And we are collecting a huge amount of data, and let's not miss that moment. So I'm really passionate about that. And I will link in a little bit to what's happening at Legal & General as well. So, Rebecca, you touched on inclusive capitalism. At Legal & General, we believe that we're focusing on driving sort of our capital and our assets in driving social good. And we have many, many proof points around sort of the ecosystem as a business, where we're an insurer, we're an investor, we focus on retirement, but we also build, and we're building in communities, we're building assets, and there's a real driver that we drive better back into society. It's called inclusive capitalism. And that's not just for what we're doing externally, it's a big focus for us as an organization in building an inclusive culture. But like all organizations, we're on a journey, and Helena will be familiar with the journey that we've been on at Legal & General, where we've done some fantastic things. We've focused quite heavily in characteristics, and we've had what I'd say individual progress in those spaces. More recently, our focuses have been really joining up our diversity and inclusion agenda. And as part of that, and rightly so, putting data absolutely at the heart of that and helping us understand where we are as an organization is so critical. And what's also critical in that, when we've done that, is also to be really frank and open about the gaps that we have and the challenges that we have, and not to be fearful of that. To really face into it, and also understand that it's complex. And one of the points the report brought out quite heavily is that we need to think about this holistically. And so intersectionality from a data perspective is really critical, but not just around characteristics, but more broadly around the data that we have that helps us understand that we're all individuals who want to come to work and to bring our best selves in an environment that's inclusive. And that correlation between the data points is so critical. So how are we on the journey to get there? Well, we've invested in asking questions. What do we want to understand from our data? And then investing in technology and the right reporting. To a point, we now have a people data warehouse that is really setting us up for success. Equally, as part of my team, as part of EX, we have also built a people and data and insight team. So we're sustaining that focus. And as we build our knowledge around our data and what it's telling us and drives us to act, we're continuing to ask the questions and continuing to try and understand where our challenges are. From the point of view of data collection, because I think this is still very much an issue, and the speakers earlier talked a lot about trust. How do we build trust with our people that we will use that data in the right way to build that better environment, to build more inclusivity? And I think that is still a challenge, both in legal and general, but more broadly. And you know, we are on the process of trying a number of things. We have recently created a D&I council, which is sponsored by 3 of our CEOs. And as part of that, you know, and we are a data business, so focusing on the data is key. But as part of that, them telling their stories around why they think their data is important, and how we might utilize and build a better environment with more sharing of data. I go back to the point that you know, we are all thinking about the way we're working at the moment. There are many surveys, many pulse surveys going on at the moment, asking people around, you know, how they want to work in an office, outside of an office, working more flexibly. So it is a moment where, you know, we could enrich that set and grow from this point.
Thank you, Heather. Luba, I'm just going to come to you. When we spoke, we talked a lot about your role and what the expectations are when it comes to what you're expecting to get from the asset managers and the people that you're engaging with, and what sort of metrics and what sort of and how that impacts the decisions that you're making in terms of how that reflects the performance or the decision making or the culture of the organization you're reviewing. Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. And thank you for involving me in this event. Similar to everyone else, I found the report incredibly useful, and it resonated with my own experience. We as an investment consultant, we research and rate hundreds of investment organizations out there. And diversity has become a critical component of the assessment of skill. And it's interesting to reflect about the journey there. So for many leaders of organizations, the journey starts with the purpose, why we are collecting this data. And in my observation, in many instances, the journey starts with, okay, it's a social justice, reputational reason, so it's just the right thing to do. And then at some point, when they start getting diverse perspectives in their decision-making, be it investment decisions or business decisions, all of a sudden there is almost like this light bulb moment. Wow, it's really making me a better decision maker. Let's do more of that. Let's find ways to collect this data and act on that. So that's genuinely very helpful part of the journey when we move from social justice to that really makes commercial and investment sense. And just reflecting on your question, Rebecca, specifically on our journey of data collection from other organizations, which is even harder than collecting data internally. We started this journey around 6 years ago when we started asking managers on gender data and racial and ethnical diversity data. And when I think back to this time, I did have those bizarre conversations where I would get the response, you know, we are not allowed to tell you how many female fund managers we have in our organizations. And I would respond, well, it's really important. So how about we get everyone in the room and we count? But fortunately, we no longer have this conversation. So at the moment, gender diversity and ethnical diversity is mandatory. So we wouldn't proceed if we are not able to get this data from asset managers. It's all on an anonymous basis for us, but we need to engage with organizations and understand how much weight they put on this factor, and do they have action plans on how they're going to improve that. And I saw one of the questions actually in the Q&A about, do we actually have the data on return on investment on D&I? And it's an interesting point because we have data from academia on the performance of delivering on cognitive tasks, or from corporates, how better their performance becomes. But with investments, it's harder just because it takes so much time to assess the correlation between the changes in the diversity composition and investment performance. But we have been collecting this data for already, 5 years of robust data. So we can already draw some conclusions, and the correlation is positive. So I want to wait for a few more years before we go public and say, yes, here is the outperformance, but it's definitely not negative, and there is a positive correlation there. So I will probably stop here, Rebecca, just for the sake of time.
Thank you. That's incredibly insightful and ties very much with those business findings, those business outcomes that Catherine talked about as well. James, I just wanted to come to you. When we spoke, it was really interesting that one of the motivating factors was that you were reviewing the employee value proposition in the business, and that data collection and understanding the start point got integrated with that project. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, Rebecca, thank you very much. I mean, you're right. I mean, it started actually with when I took over as the group CEO just over 18 months ago, and setting out our sort of 5-year strategy. The establishment of a new EVP, employee value proposition, was a sort of key part of that, certainly from a people perspective. David Peach joining us as the new head of HR, and I work very closely with him in terms of setting out some objectives. And I know a lot of people look at sort of the EVP as just all being around sort of salary and the compensation, benefits, all that side of things. But it's much more. It's much deeper than that. It means, what does it mean to work for River Mercantile? What can you expect from us, and equally, what do we expect from you as an employee? Part of that was actually us trying to enhance that engagement, enhance our recruitment, enhance our retention, and ultimately enhance the client the client experience. And a key part of that EVP is diversity and inclusion. But where do you start from? You might have a diversity strategy. Say, well, listen, this is what I want to look like in 5 years' time. But how do you know what you want to look like if you don't know where you're starting from? So we had to set about gathering that information. And I'm conscious that it's one of those very sensitive areas. People's rights to give certain information are protected, and we can't insist on that. And so from the very outset, we were very clear that this was going to be a sort of voluntary process. But we also recognized that if we just went out cold and sent a survey out, response rates would be very, very low. And so what was really key was that we made sort of communication a central part of that, and it had to start from the top, had to start from me setting out not just the fact we were going to do it, please fill it in, but actually why we're doing it, what we needed the information for, how we were going to use it, and how we were going to make things better. And I think that is a really crucial part of the overall process, is making sure that communication was out there. We then also tried to make it as straightforward as possible. When you're starting something, you want to train to be an engineer. You don't go out and say, well, this time next year I'm going to build a rocket ship. You start trying to build something probably a little bit more straightforward to begin with. And that was with this. We didn't get involved or try to deal with some of the certainly some more complex intersectionality elements or features, but we kept it based around the nationality and gender and ethnic origin, disability, age, sexual orientation, and religion. And we try to keep it around those sort of main factors. And we had a little bit of a debate about it, but not a huge debate. It's like a lot of things. If you go too deep, you can exclude everything at the end of the day. So we wanted to try and make it as simple and straightforward. And then we wanted to make sure that the process by capturing that information was became routine, because I think if you you do it as a special exercise where you go out with these, with questionnaires, it's not routine. So we embedded it within our HR systems, and it was the sort of key part of the HR system that we had, and that makes it much easier then to analyze it alongside other items like salary, career progression, all those side of things. So we incorporated it within those systems, but at all the time communicating with people why we were doing that. And we were obviously delighted with the result. We had over a 76% response rate, and people completing and being prepared to complete and being prepared to trust us. But it's like all things, if you communicate at the beginning, you've got to communicate on the way through, encourage on the way through, and then analyze that and report back. And I think that's a really important part of it. We're in an industry where we spend a lot of our time analyzing complex investment issues, analyzing complex numerical issues. Analyzing our people should be second nature to that. So going through that, understanding what the data we captured, how we can develop that, and then reporting back to people and explaining to them, well, what are we going to do with that? Yeah. So that gave us the base from which we can then say, okay, well, this is where we are, where ideally do we want to get to, and why do we want to get to, and then actually setting ourselves some objectives, embedding those objectives across the business and the leadership teams, and making sure that everybody understands the why and how we're going to be able to do that. But listen, we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not standing up here saying we're perfect across everything. Clearly, the data which came out of that suggested we weren't perfect. We're good in certain areas, but not in others. And I think that was the last thing I wanted to say was we then, once we've identified that, is then not trying to say, well, we're going to fix everything in one go. Let's look at those areas where we think, one, we've got some real catch up to do. Let's look at those things where actually the impact is going to be greatest and focus on those. Yeah. And keep moving it forward, and then take it back, and then make sure that you're continuously capturing that information. People change, and so make sure that data capture is routine. It's not just a one-off exercise.
I think that voiceover from a case study perspective as well, and just to let the audience know that in the report there is lots of case studies that you can learn from, and James is one of them. But I think what's really interesting about that is having the confidence to collect the data, and I heard this from all of you when we were speaking, because the data is the start point from which you can then manage progress. But actually, it's like all data in businesses, there are going to be years or months or quarters that you underperform, and some quarters that you overperform, because it's going to be a continual part of managing the performance of the business. And we have to, as teams and leaders and organizations, be more accountable and confident in exactly that. It's a journey, but we have to start, and that's been incredibly valuable. And I also would echo, and again, I know we spoke about it, Luba and Heather as well, that the importance, and I would say this, wouldn't I, from Lanson's perspective, but the importance of communication before, during, and after a process to actually facilitate the trust that's needed and the understanding and confidence that there's a start to this journey, then there's going to be an action plan, then we'll report against the action plan. And you know what? Sometimes we'll do really well and sometimes we won't. But I know, James, when we spoke, you were also like, we're all in this together. It's an accountability across a firm if we're going to make those strides rather than one area. John, I just want to come to you. When we spoke, you had some gritty, wonderful sound bites in terms of the importance of data collection. So I wondered if you wanted to inject some controversy and some sort of claims to this debate, because I think you had some lovely phrases that I certainly thought were well worth sharing.
Got permission to be controversial. Okay,
Please.
well, thank you, Rebecca. I'm not sure about controversial. I would echo a really important undercurrent of what people have been saying. Confidence, and one of the results is 50% of the HR leaders coming out in this survey have said that the confidence or lack of confidence and lack of trust in senior leaders in doing the right thing with the data or doing anything with the data is a barrier, a major barrier. And this is really critical. And I'd go as far as saying for senior leaders who are very good at setting the tone, excellent at setting the tone of diversity and inclusion really matters in their organization, then treat it like any other business critical issue. And for any other business critical issue, just as James has just said, every organization collects the data, analyzes the data, puts governance around it, puts resources around it, and ensures that the analysis inputs into the insights required to decide what to do, rather than just guessing, or rather just following a competitor just because they've done it, we'll do this. Well, without testing, having the data to start with and testing that, you don't know whether that's true or not. And so you're just shooting in the sky. And so you really need to, the collection of the data is hard, but it's the start point. It's the start point. It's analysis to provide insights to then decide what you really need to do in the organization to make the changes to make you a better organization that really matters.
Thank you. And as you say, those gaps create reputational risk, in the sense that if you're not collecting the data and you can't talk about progress, then you need to be very careful about what you're actually going to be saying. So thank you, panel. Now we are only 5 minutes off, and I do want to hand back to Matt as well to just have some closing remarks. I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions that have come in. Let's see what we have here. There's quite a lot of very lengthy questions. Let's see. I think people are talking a lot about how do you actually get the response rate up? So what are the ways and means that we might actually drive that engagement in our people, and how do we get the response rate up in order to ensure that we have both the right amount of data that we can work with, but also we get over that trust barrier? Is there anybody on the panel that would like to pick that one up?
Rebecca, I'm happy. I mean, I think it all comes back to communication. You know, there's a natural aversion for people to give you information if they don't know why you want it. So if you can put it into context, listen, it comes back to the point you made before. I know we talked about it yesterday. It's everybody's challenge. It's everybody's problem. It's everybody's objectives to try and improve things. And I think if you put it into that context and say, listen, you know, you need to understand why we're doing this and how things are going to get better, then I think people are prepared to trust you. But it has to be a continuous process of communication.
I think I've got a balance here between actually handing over to Matt to close and trying to take some more questions. So what I'm going to do is make a note of the questions, and we will share some more feedback on the Diversity Project Forum against some of the themes that have cropped up there. But thank you, panel. You've all given wonderful perspectives. Thank you, the Diversity Project. I can only ask everybody that's still watching and listening to have a look at the report, the findings and the case studies. And I'd just like to hand over to Matt, who's just going to give us a few closing remarks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you to the panel. There's some really great questions actually that I can see that have come through, and some good comments as well. So what we will make sure that we do is sort of look at those questions after this webinar and actually go to each of the panel as well to get their viewpoints, so we can share some answers to some of the great questions that are coming through. I'm a big believer in sort of keeping to time, so I want to make sure everyone can get off this webinar in the next sort of minute and before 1 o'clock. But I think, you know, really interesting sort of discussion. Hopefully what this report has done, holding up a mirror, has really sort of created a current picture of kind of where the industry is at the moment, with some practical recommendations and spotlighting some of the good practices happening within firms that are really making a difference. And I guess just sort of as final points, really I've got 2 asks for today. One is to make sure that you download the report and do read that and discuss it with your colleagues. The second point really is to really sort of start to tell yourself that actually diversity data is a positive business reputation and talent enhancer. And actually it need not be a problem. And actually when we can shift our mindset to one of sort of progress and solutions, we do actually have a really big opportunity to get ahead. So I know Linda will be making Linda for the Diversity Project will be making the report available on the website, and there'll be a link sent out to everybody who is registered for today and for the event, but please do download that. And yeah, thank you very much all for joining today. Thank you very much.